Hey, welcome to the recap of Chapter 4 of How to Lose a Planet, the Afro-Future Epic. For every recap, you get something true, a storytelling tip, and something that I liked about the thing I just read, which is Chapter 4 in this case. So, something true. Okay, so the particular structure for this book was inspired by Game of Thrones. And I'll tell you why. Because I around that time, figured out that the thing that wasn't working about my book was the structure. It didn't have your familiar 3-act structure, which is familiar at least to the Western world. And so once I worked that out, then I realized, okay, I'm telling this book from 5 people's different points of view. Kato, Lacey, and 3 other characters yet to be named. And what I wanted was to have each of those characters have their own individual structure, right? Because when I finally decided to structure the book, it was with Kato at the center. So Kato's arc, you got the inciting incident, midpoint, climax, and then we wrap things up. But for the other 4 characters, I wanted that same kind of structure, so all those stories matched up. I wanted to do this specifically because Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin's first book, Game of Thrones, not his first book ever, but the first book in the Game of Thrones series. So he told the story from multiple points of view, and one of those points of view was a character named Dany Targaryen. I think it's Daenerys Targaryen. So if you pull out all those chapters from Daenerys Targaryen, you get an entire story with its own arc. Such a tight story with its own arc that actually, those chapters individually won, I think it was a Nebula Award for best novella, because it almost operates as its own short book, a short story. So that's the kind of thing that inspired me to kind of not just do the 3-act structure, but also make sure that each point of view character, and the 5 of them, had their own 3-act structure. Now, that just said, I also just lied to you, because actually only 4 out of 5 characters have the typical 3-arc structure. One character, their structure is very flat for a very specific reason. Once you get to the epilogue, you'll understand why. But yeah, so that was a true thing that inspired the 3-act structure, the multiple point of views, and the fact that each point of view character got their own 3-act structure. Because in this 4th chapter, we don't just get to see the world through Lacey's eyes, we also get to see Lacey's inciting incident. In early videos, I talked about how I included the inciting incident in the 1st chapter because I was trying to get the book picked up by agents, by the industry, and it typically won't allow splash in the 1st chapter to hook the reader. But because the inciting incident usually needs some of the world to be developed so that the inciting incident matters. Because what the inciting incident does is it destroys the normal world. So what I did was, I gave you the who, what, where, when, and how of the inciting incident in chapter 1, with a little bit of the normal world before the inciting incident, which is the jailbreak, right? Then chapter 2, chapter 3, more of the world. Then chapter 4, we get the why of the inciting incident. Why is Lacey participating in this jailbreak? Because she's being coerced. Now in chapter 5, we'll get the last bit of why is Kato being broken out of prison in the first place. But that's all just to go back to my original point, that Game of Thrones, point of view characters, all pretty much just inspired by my desire to get the best story out there as possible. Tip. Okay, storytelling tip. I think I just talked about that. The tip is going to be about structure and inciting incidents and stuff like that, and how within this chapter of chapter 4, you get to see Lacey, and you get to find out the why of her inciting incident, because she accidentally made contact with Brian. Brian was crewed all the way up, and she kind of exposed him to conspiracy charges, which would have messed up him and his whole team. Even though Brian was going to spend the rest of his life in jail anyway, you'll find out why in chapter 5. So that's the tip when you're actually doing the point of view characters, to actually make sure they have a structure so that your audience can follow along. Again, the thing about structure that works as far as just following a traditional Western 3-act structures, just acknowledging who your audience is and what your audience has been consuming, whether they know it or not. Most of us have been consuming the 3-act structure for a long, long time. Even back when we were little kids, didn't know what was going on. We just knew the animals were talking. It was a lot of fun. The songs were good, but we were also absorbing the 3-act structure. So it's really deeply ingrained. So you're seeing it without knowing that you know it without knowing that you know it, so to speak. That's why we keep going to rom-coms, even though we know they break up, but they're going to get back together 95-6% of the time. All right, so the last thing, something I liked. Interesting. So this chapter used to be a lot longer and have a lot more gory, gritty details about the city and how much damage the gangsters were doing to the city. And all that was part of the influence of Mario Puzo when I was a little boy. So I won't say that Mario Puzo was a great writer, but I've always found him to be a very compelling storyteller, in the sense that I was raised in a Christian household, fairly conservative, and Mario Puzo was great at writing smut. And it really taught me the value of smut and how stories can actually be fun, and in some ways should be fun. And I was having a lot of fun reading these stories. I've read Dark Arena, Omerta, The Last Dawn, Fools Die, The Godfather, The Sicilian, The Fourth K, a few others that I'm forgetting. But I read a lot of his books, and what I noticed when reading this chapter is that I pulled back a lot because Mario Puzo did overwrite, but I really liked just two things. Well, three things. Let me see, check my notes. I liked that I was going for fun. I liked that there was a lot of research that went into this story. So one of the things that got cut out of chapter 4 was a story about how at some point it's mentioned that water might be why people were going crazy in the 4 cities, which is now known as Quest City, that the bad water supply was just messing with their brains. Another theory that got chopped out, but was also based on my research, was that it was a space travel from Earth across the stars, and all that space travel for countless amount of years changed human DNA, made them a little crazy, which is based on the research that I mentioned in a previous video about these two identical twins. And one was left on Earth, the other was sent into space for 6 months. When the one in space came back down to Earth, they found that his DNA had changed. So they were technically no longer identical twins because of the DNA change, which was just caused by hanging out in space for 6 months. So that was like another piece of research that led to a theory that ended up getting chopped because that chapter was seemingly a little long. Why I bring that up in tandem with Mario Puzo is that when Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather, there's a story about how he was in a bar hanging out and just minding his business when his mob guy approaches him and asks him, "What family are you with?" And Mario Puzo's like, "I promise you, bro, that was never my life. It's just research, reading, just a huge nerd." But I like that story just in the sense that it made research seem cool to me, seem cooler to me than some teacher saying, "Yeah, if you want to write a book, you got to do a lot of research." That sounds like a lot of work. But hearing this story about how Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather and some monster approached him and asked him what crew he was with because the story was so believable, so just well done and richly textured, made me just excited about the power of research and the power of storytelling as well. And the third thing, this is interesting. A friend told me this story about Mario Puzo and how he had written numerous books before The Godfather, and I've read most of them, if not all of them, and they're all good, and they're all very well received by critics. He was still broke though. And so one day he just looked at the American landscape and realized, y'all want a mafia story. So he took the most powerful person he knew, his mother, and based Michael Corleone on her, which I find interesting for a number of reasons, because at the time, in the 60s, the mafia was still a very negative stigma for Italian Americans. Italian Americans probably weren't considered white people for more than 50 years at the time, because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they were still getting lynched. They were still being called white niggas. So I find it interesting that in the 60s, he saw the landscape and he made that choice. But he knew where the wind was going. But for me, it's a matter of the soul, a question of the soul. Like, as an artist, how do you make it? And maybe it's because you know where the wind's going and there's a stink on the wind, but you can still find your own way, because a book like The Godfather, honestly for me, it's not even a mobster book. It's a book about family, like most of his books were. The Sicilian about family, Omerta, family, The Last Dawn, family. So maybe you can see where the wind's going and still find a way to make your own way. Deuces.